going to be an absolute disaster. Right. I guess I'm screen sharing. Are people here? You tell me when to start. I see one person in the chat.
Yes, Doctor. Now the attendees are here.
Two people are here.
No, we have around 30.
I can't even hear you.
We have around 30.
Around 30.
Yes.
Okay, because I see 3 people in the chat. Okay, we'll just give it another minute, then we'll get started. Let me get a phone time. Right, we'll just give it 1 minute to get people, allow people to get here and get started. Now what happened? You tell me when to start, Sidekick. Anyhow, we'll get started. I see 13 in the chat. In fact, just let's see. Right. Okay. Anyhow, we'll get started. Welcome. For the next 45 minutes to an hour, there were a bunch of people in the chat. Oh, they're back to 2. There were a few more. Welcome, everybody. For the next 45 minutes, approximately an hour, I'll be talking about diversity in the workplace and why it's an important concept and why it's a value-added proposition. And I want to thank my sidekick here that does the technical stuff, because that's not me. Because well, there we are. First of all, if you can just have a look at these 2 diagrams, these 2 pictures, and tell me, you can either type into the chat, or you can just shout it out. Tell me what you see. Just looking at the 2 pictures, what do you see? In the 2 very straightforward, very simple pictures, but what do you see when you look at these 2 pictures? Anybody? As we just start to get warmed up while people are still entering into the class, it's not a class, into the room, into the space here. Anybody? Ah, here we are. We're getting a few comments. That's great. Okay, celebrating different cultures. Okay, festival. Okay, that's interesting, because what happens is typically people, festivals, celebrations, yeah. And it's interesting, when I first showed these pictures about a year and a half ago, a lot of people would see completely different things. They would talk about the Chinese versus the Western, Christmas versus Chinese New Year by the looks of it, all these different things, but it would be about differences. Whereas now what's interesting is you're talking about you're beginning to talk more about similarities, and that's important to be able to work effectively within a diverse environment, is to look, we recognize and acknowledge differences, but to be able to work effectively, we have to find commonalities to build bridges of trust to move forward in an effective way, so that we're all having a shared co-created experience that we all understand and share equally. But it's really interesting from my perspective to see how things have changed in the last year and a half or so. And that was what this question says. Now, I'd like to start off with Sheikh Zayed, and because when we look at diversity, we'll kind of touch on 2 areas of diversity and keep it somewhat simple and streamlined. And we can go into many other types of diversity. And a lot of the information comes from the West, mainly Canada, United States, Great Britain, and things of that nature. But what we're interested in is gender diversity, male and female, because that has huge implications, particularly here in the UAE right now, with on the governing council. One of the sheikhs is pressing very hard for greater representation of women at the senior management levels and also on the boards of director levels. So things are changing and trying to change rapidly within this country, which makes it quite important. And Sheikh Zayed was always a huge proponent and supporter of gender diversity and gender equity movements. You need the, as he says, you need the best to be a top nation. You have to employ all the people to all their capacities possible. You take the best, and gender is a secondary factor. We need the best engineers. We need the best doctors. We need the best teachers. We need the best managers, leaders, all these other types of people. And that's why this quote I find is very important for what we're going to be discussing, because it's about gender equity, but it's also about culture as well. As we know, the Emiratis make approximately 10 to 15% of the population. The rest of us all come from afar, and to work effectively together can be very, very challenging no matter where we are. And this is how we're going to spend the next bit of time, is on these things as we build on some of the backgrounds things where Sheikh Nayan, the Minister of Tolerance as well, continues to build on the idea that the UAE's cultural diversity drives its economic, social, intellectual development, and supporting cultural diversity brings together all members of the community to promote sustainable development and peace. So they have a very aggressive, very forward-looking aspiration for how they want this country to unfold over the next 50 years, having just celebrated their 50th anniversary, and the strides they've made so far have been remarkable. Now, this is a little bit old. 2019, Sheikh Zayed's statements were a year before that, I believe, maybe 2 years before that, but it's the way things are heading. So what we want to think about is, first and foremost, now this is where I need my colleagues' help probably, is we want to take the hiring bias test. Now, the real test will be is, will it work? Right. Now here's the quiz, and we should be able to take the quiz. Or maybe not. It was working earlier. Yeah, there we go. We want to take this quiz. Oops. Now what happened? It was working. It was working. And now all we have is advertising. What happened? What happened? And yeah, we'll just, how do I get out of here? Where's my guy? Where is my guy? How do I get out of this? How do I get out of this? How do I get, I don't want to stop sharing. How do I get out of this? Oh, here we are. I'm back. Right. What we'll do is this. I apologize for that. It was working earlier, but we'll continue on with that. You can access these slides and this link at a later point, because we want to continue on, because it's interesting for you to measure what your biases are, because we'll talk about it in a second. Biases are very important, and we all have various biases, whether we want to acknowledge them or not, if we're aware of them or not. But most of the time, our biases, we want to be aware of them and acknowledge them and move forward, but they're biases that aren't out of animosity or things of that nature. So this forms the beginning as we continue forward. And this comes from research done by McKinsey, the consulting firm. and is based on North American research, but is to make the case of the importance of diversity and inclusion, because diversity and inclusion are not the same things, as we'll see in a few minutes. Because what the research has found mainly in the United States, is that companies that are gender diverse, that include men and women, but include men and women in meaningful ways, female engineers, male engineers with equitable opportunities for growth, development, participation, contribution, outperform their competitors by approximately 15%. So there's a huge dividend for taking on diversity, gender diversity in a meaningful way. Now, in the countries such as the UAE and elsewhere, but we're most interested here, is that ethnically diverse companies, so people that take on people from around the world in meaningful ways, they're not just there to tick boxes, as they say in the United Kingdom in particular. Oh, we're diverse, tick a box, tick a box, tick a box, so on and so forth. The research is unequivocal that those that take on ethnic diversity, cultural diversity in a meaningful way, where people are included, allowed to contribute in a meaningful way, grow, develop, so on and so forth, those organizations will outperform their competition by approximately 35%. So these are huge reasons, bottom line reasons, regardless of how we might feel about diversity or inclusion, why it's important to take on board other people and people that are different, and then find ways to co-create shared meaning, shared understanding. Because as we'll see, the toolkit we have will become far larger. So, and this just highlights that what was interesting is the top quartile for diversity are more effective when it comes to financial performance. And you're all in the HR department, people, you're all working for organizations. So we've moved beyond the classroom, and this is why it's important. But what's interesting as well, and the link is below for you to look up the materials, is that 38% of the Americans they surveyed in 2018 said that it's a high priority for companies. It's a high priority here as well to talk about diversity, embracing diversity and things of that nature. But what's interesting as well is the good intentions that people say don't necessarily get translated into real experiences or actions. So there's a disconnect that we have to think about. And I'm interested to hear your comments through the chat, if in fact this reflects your realities here as well. We talk and commit a lot of energy to the ideas in and around diversity, but are people and are the organizations, or is your experience reflective of what was just said here through the research, where the real reality is not what research may say? So what we want to think about is some other reasons for diversity is if we have more people with different ideas, whether it's gender differences, men see the world one way, women see the world another way. There's lots of overlap, of course, but depending what you're trying to do, it can help drive innovation, just like cultural diversity can help drive innovation as well. We come from different backgrounds. We can bring our backgrounds and ideas together and co-create a new larger 1 + 1 = 3 synergy type of outcome, which is better than if everybody was the same, sharing a smaller group of ideas. You have different market knowledges potentially. People in this country, they come from around the world. They come from all over the Middle East. They come from India, Pakistan, Canada, United States, Germany, China, everywhere. So they have local market knowledges as well that can help make your organization more competitive. But because you have this more specialized knowledge from people from around the world, you can also develop higher quality, better targeted marketing that will better meet the identified needs of different societies. Because as we know, not every country or culture is the same. People have different priorities, different things that are different in importance. What attracts people to a product in Canada may not be the same as in Britain. In fact, it won't be the same as in Britain, as one example. Same as whatever happens over here or in India. But we also, if an organization takes diversity seriously, whether it's gender diversity or cultural diversity, if they take it seriously and an organization, it becomes an incredibly powerful recruiting tool. And the talent pool available becomes larger. People are drawn to organizations where there's opportunities. So you'll have a larger talent pool to draw on than if you limit or if you limit people from different cultures to window dressing types of positions or certain clusters of positions. If in fact they're actively brought into the organization and people become aware of that with lots of growth and opportunities, it becomes a win-win proposition for everybody. And that pool of talent will improve. And then we talk more about being more adaptable for products as well, but also diverse teams with work can be more productive and perform better because you do have more ways of addressing an issue or a problem. But to do that requires more work quite often and goodwill as well, because people are different. We come with with biases as well. So the final point is, and it links back to earlier, is companies and organizations that take diversity seriously and inclusion seriously, the people have the opportunities for professional growth. And if people have those opportunities, that attracts people to your organization. So we want to think about those things. But true diversity, we're going to focus mainly on gender, but also in and around the issues of cultural diversity for time constraints and for simplicity as well. But it can mean people from all kinds of backgrounds and identities at every level of the organization. It's not uncommon to have all kinds of people from around the world or both genders, males and females, within your organizations, but they can be ghettoized into certain clusters or professions or jobs at different levels with certain levels of promotion and opportunity or not. But if we look at the picture, it's a very telling picture. If you wanted, and why diversity is important, for example, if you wanted to hire a top scientist to help build the mission to Mars here in the UAE, we think of Stephen Hawking. If we look at Stephen Hawking, who passed away several years ago, a mind that was on par with Albert Einstein when it comes to the cosmos and all these types of things. If you looked at him as a person, he suffered from, I think, cystic fibrosis, was in a wheelchair. If you just looked at him, he might, in bygone eras, be dismissed. And yet he was one of the most brilliant minds there were in the areas necessary to develop the space programs, to help develop the mission to Mars. And that's why we want to look at the qualities and capacities of the people relevant to the positions rather than the superficial characteristics. So we think about diversity can be surface level, the things that really aren't all that important. In the wheelchair, doesn't matter if it's a group of scientists developing whatever's necessary for the UAE's successful mission to Mars. Doesn't matter that the person's in a wheelchair developing whatever they're developing. Probably not. So we want to always be thinking about these types of things. So, but with diversity, it's also about inclusion. So it's great to have all the various people. I mean, quite often we'll just look at the superficial things, skin color, whatever it might be, in a wheelchair or not. but it's also about inclusion, and that's different. Because inclusion is about supporting the employees and acknowledging that people have different needs. As an example, there's here, and coming from Canada, when I first came here, it was somewhat disorienting to hear the call to prayers 5 times a day, somewhat disruptive to the workday, because it was something completely unfamiliar to me. However, we learn to adapt and adjust, and it doesn't matter because it's important to the people that take the time to pray and acknowledge their faith and everything else, but it's not affecting in any way, shape, or form the duties that they're performing. But it's important to support the people, and the reverse would be more appropriate if, in fact, the people were going to Canada. Muslims were going to Canada on some sort of project or something like that. But we want to do that, but diverse companies aren't necessarily successful if they don't include people. It's great to have the people, but we want, as Sheikh Zayed said, we want the best people to drive the world forward, to drive your country forward, to drive your organizations forward. And that's important to think about and embrace. And sometimes it won't be that easy. So we think about biases, and they've outlined all kinds of biases, over 150 different biases. Some of them are like salami slicing, but 4 big biases that affect us, what we're talking about directly right now, are things, and we're familiar with them. And a lot of times they will exist without them even knowing, or without us even knowing or understanding that, in fact, they may occur. We may treat the person in the wheelchair from that picture earlier differently. We may do that, and we may not even realize it. We may be talking more in a more childlike voice for some reason, and it's quite common that people do that, thinking that somehow they're not fully functioning adults and stuff like that. But there can be things such as in-group biases, which is, say, favoritism, and research is very clear. And there is a neurobiological basis to it, sociobiological basis to it, like favor like. So we have to be always aware of these things and looking at building bridges and finding what we share in common. A second stereotype, that's called in-group bias. We favor people who are similar. And it could be similar in the sense that it could be religion, countries you're from, engineers hanging with engineers, HR hanging with HR people, because you're looking for commonalities. And we may not realize that. Or there can be what's called an outgroup bias. And we can think of that in the terms of stereotyping. We have preconceived notions, even when we're very aware of them. They can sneak in, particularly when people are under stress, that we stereotype people. That person in the picture in the wheelchair, we may have preconceived notions that they're not as capable. But I return to Stephen Hawking, who was acknowledged to be a mind in the areas of cosmology similar to Einstein. The wheelchair is not a factor, but we may stereotype the person that somehow they're somewhat lesser because they're in a wheelchair. And things may happen like that all the time. But that's about differences. And we can create positive or negative views based on differences as well. So another one linked to stereotyping is prejudice, that we actively treat people differently because they're different. We have a preconceived stereotype or preconceived notion based on some sort of previous experience from somewhere. It may be what our parents said. It may be what we observed when we were children. There can be all kinds of reasons, but it can lead to prejudices. But the big thing is what's a confirmation bias. Is that we privilege information that supports our worldviews, and that can feed into creating prejudices, stereotypes, favoritism, and these other ones. Information that reinforces our worldview is given preference over information that may challenge our worldview. And it's very important to be aware of that and being open and able to challenge ourselves. Now, there's a short video that I hope works. And okay, I'm having a problem again. Now, how do I, oh, here we go. How do I get out of this one?
Doctor, click on browse YouTube. Yes.
I just clicked on browse YouTube. Oh. Then what happened? What's up here now? What is this? What happened?
Close this window, doctor. From up.
What the hell happened?
Close the window, doctor.
I'm hearing 3 or 4 voices now. Just useless. Well, where am I? What the? Oh, this is terrible. No. This guy's fucking useless. What is this?
Doctor, can you hear me?
I hear somebody. I hear something. I hear the video too.
I am Ibrahim. You can close the window. Just close it, please. Close the window from up, right. Yeah, this one. Yeah. And that's it.
Right. This won't end soon enough.
It's okay, doctor. Calm down.
Right. Okay. Now, how do I get rid of this? This is too much.
Minimize the window from right. From right. Minimize it from right.
No.
No. Up, left. Third button.
This is
from up right in the corner. Yeah. Click on that.
okay. Right. So these biases are very important to consider. Right. But the other thing is, with the biases, we want to also be very aware of what we say, because a lot of times, and this feeds into the biases, the words we use carry a lot of connotations, and how we say things can, whether we realize it or not, denigrate other people and create some sort of bias or prejudice without even realizing it. And we want everybody to be coming together, you know, because the words have the power to tear down or build up based on how we may say something. And we can start off with a very negative comment towards one person, but always be speaking from a positive perspective towards another person. So that's just what these two things say, essentially the same thing. But these, at the most fundamental level, can help create a more positive, inclusive environment, or can ostracize and isolate people. We want to be very, very aware of that as we move forward. So you think about it though, and you can type it into the chat. What are some of the issues at your workplace that you may face, either you yourself or you in your capacity within HR, in developing programs that are far more embracing of diversity and inclusivity? And I know the UAE's made great strides over the last few years on working on things such as inclusivity, but it's very important to think about these things, but type in into the chat some of your ideas to share with your colleagues, because in the past there have been people raise, you know, fairly significant issues on different topics such as glass ceilings and things of that nature that in fact were very problematic, but are slowly being addressed with time. So, and some of the things that, these are just a few from previous research, is that colleagues from some cultures may feel less likely to let their voices be heard. So what that means, you as in HR, or when you're helping your colleagues develop programs or become far more effective working in multicultural environments, or working with women, or women working with men, may in fact encourage and draw out people to share, to give them voice, to have them speak up and have the confidence to speak up within the organization. That can be very, very important. But also across multicultural teams, we can face negative cultural stereotypes, and we always want to be on the watch for that, and reminding ourselves and others as well that in fact we want to make sure we have to be careful, because some of what we quite often, oh, we're just joking, may not be taken as a joke by somebody else for a variety of reasons. They may be considered very insulting comments, and we want to be very aware of that. So we want to make sure that when we communicate, that our communication is very clear, very precise, and very focused on what the tasks at hand are about, and that once the information is shared out, that we, whether it's verbal or written, that in fact we want to gain feedback to ensure that we are co-creating a shared understanding of whatever the language and messages are. And that's very important to think about. Now, one of the other things that's always brought up is there's always issues in and around the cost of accommodating the workplace requirements can quite often be difficult. And it can be everything from visa requirements, different employment laws, all these other things that may come into place. And this becomes perhaps a bigger issue in somewhere like the United States, where they have an incredibly complex legal framework that they work within now. But also to be careful about different professional etiquette and be aware of different professional etiquette, because that can be very problematic if we're not aware of that. A lot of times we may, especially when we're new, may inadvertently do something, not out of malice, but out of ignorance by not knowing. As an example, when I first came here, I had barely arrived, and I put my hand out to shake Natalie Tofflis's hand. She was a teaching assistant. Now, she was in an abaya, and she says, no. I didn't mean anything by it. That's what you would do in Canada. And she explained, she was a Canadian. She was actually an Egyptian Canadian. She explained afterwards what the a more appropriate protocol would be. Now, that was ignorance out of not knowing, not ignorance out of a bias and malice. And we always want to be aware of that and become more aware of professional etiquette. But we can also acknowledge that mistakes can be made. And then we have to decide, and whoever else it is, if those decisions and behaviors are being made out of malice, or if they're just being made out of ignorance in the sense that they didn't mean anything by it, they were just unaware, and it probably won't happen again, because most people are big enough and generous enough people that it'll be okay. And then, but it can also lead to conflicting work styles. That can be a real issue if we think about some of the cultural models you may or may not be familiar with, whereas in fact, different cultures have different concepts of time. For example, a German or Swiss, a 9 o'clock meeting starts at 9 o'clock, not 9:01, not 9:15. Whereas if you're in the Philippines or in Spain, a 9 o'clock meeting might be more a suggestion. 9 o'clock might be 9:15, might be 9:30, so on and so forth. And that can be very, very problematic within work groups here that you work with, as just one very superficial example. But these types of things can get played out on an hourly basis within the workplace. So we think about that. You want to think about, how do you manage diversity and inclusion? Now that we have a bit of idea and background about what the ideas are, some of the main issues. So what we want to look about is, and this is based on research from Harvard from Harvard. And what it suggests is that most workplaces have diversity programs, but most diversity programs don't do very well. They really aren't reaching the objectives of diversity and inclusion. Now, this is based on research, and it's research from the United States, and is fairly recent, 2018. Whereas part of the reason is there can be issues in and around an us versus them mindset that may be triggered with inclusion programs. We have to include more or different people. Those that are there, perhaps some may say in a position of privilege, may feel that they're being pushed aside or threatened. So we want to be aware of these types of things. So there's just a few general steps. There is no one size fits all. Here's how you make your program. What I will do over the next few minutes is give you some general ideas to follow to help you think about if, in fact, you're trying to improve diversity and inclusion where you are, or set up a program if you don't have one, or you're not very satisfied with the outcomes right now. And one of the things is most programs focus on bias reduction, such as we see Americans this way, or this group, or we see women as incapable of being police officers, fighter pilots, firefighters. There was a pilot project in Sharjah 2 years ago to get females into the firefighting department. And just like in Canada 20 years ago, there was real resistance to females joining the fire department. They're not strong enough. They're not this, they're not that. Same with the police. They're not big enough. They're not strong enough. You know, to be a police officer, you originally had to be 5'10", male, physically fit, and all these other types of things. Well, what they found was when women came onto the police force, the nature of policing changed. And in some physical confrontation, it may be problematic, but what they also found is with women, the numbers of physical confrontations were reduced. That was particularly the case within domestic issues. So there was a positive trade-off. So most programs would focus on bias reductions of some kind. But what they found was quite often people become more resentful because you're perhaps highlighting things that may be imaginary, but people interpreting through their own lens. Remember the bias that we privilege information that supports our worldview. And we may see my two brothers didn't get on the police force because they had a program to hire women, as an example, off the top of my head. So we want to think about those things. The second point is, a lot of times we set up a program, okay, and it will trickle down through the organization. The managers or lead hands or whoever the designated people are will be brought in. The program will be shared, and they will become the de facto champions of pushing diversity and inclusion programs forward. Whereas, in fact, to be more successful programs invite people in from all kinds of ranks within the various work settings, not just the managers on the organizational charts, recognizing that, in fact, there's the informal leaders as well that you want to bring on board. And sometimes is also considering inviting the people that you may recognize may be the ones that will be the biggest impediments to change, because that's what you're trying to do is change attitudes, change behaviors, and therefore change your organization. So you might want to invite non-managers, non-leaders to foster communication across the organization in a multi-networked way instead of a more traditional top-down of some kind. Because if they come from different perspectives within the work group or the organization, they also can bring varying points of view as well. And as we saw earlier, 1 + 1 can equal 3. We'll have more views. We can address more issues and allay more fears and help bring more people along on the journey. A third point is we want to focus on workplace issues, not personal ones. And this can be very, very tricky because they know from research that a lot of arguments start and disagreements start focused on some aspect of a project, how to accomplish the goals or objectives. Then it may transfer to what's the process to do that. But if not handled properly, it can easily degenerate, and more often than not can, into a personal issue. It gets personalized instead of focusing on the tasks at hand. And because people are people have their biases, people have their prejudices, and that's why it's important to acknowledge that we all have our weaknesses. But if we acknowledge that, then it becomes easier to be open to co-creating shared experiences and shared understandings to help move the whole project forward on the journey that we're trying to do. A fourth thing is that quite often we'll have a program, we'll go away maybe for a half day, maybe for a day, or it may be spread over several days online or some variation right now. But it's important to have the conversations to continue, to stay accountable, to have metrics to measure against, but metrics in the sense that are we meeting our goals and objectives, but including people in the conversations from different perspectives, not just you're in charge of diversity, you're in charge of inclusion, you're in charge of this because you're the leader of the work group, you're the leader of the department, or whatever it might be, you're the head of HR. No, it's including others as well and continuing to include them, but also just almost like propaganda, encouraging and sharing information on an ongoing basis, because it's easy for things to dissipate. But continued engagement, so you want to be bringing people along, and this ties with an earlier point, you want to be having champions, you want to be having mentoring programs to bring people along throughout the organization. And they may be people, they may step forward into positions because they're interested in it for a variety of reasons. You may actively encourage people that may normally seem to be excluded for a variety of reasons. Maybe they don't speak up. Culturally, it's just not in their nature. They've learned that the boss is the boss and I'm the worker, or whatever perception there may be. Now, another point is you have to be flexible in both content and delivery. And this point can't be stressed enough, because quite often, right, we're going to have a diversity program. We're going to start becoming more inclusive. Therefore, we bought this program, we brought in consultants, but there is no one size fits all. Every organization is made up of people. And because it's made up of, every organization is made up of people, and within one organization, the people are different. The cultures and traditions that have emerged are different from one organization to another. So to think that what works at company A, there'd be overlap, but what works at company A may not work at company B, or even within the same company, it may work with engineers in the engineering department, but isn't very effective within the HR department. So we have to look at what the goals and objectives are, and how do we get to the ultimate goals and objectives. And that's more important than here's the program, and we're going to get the square peg through the round hole no matter what. So there has to be flexibility perhaps in content. As an example, as a bit of an aside, research was done at Google when Google was moving from an entrepreneurial startup to having to go to the money markets for their expansions. And they brought in consultants, but what they had to do was, because it was entrepreneurial, engineers were engaging in all kinds of projects with little structure. But they had to bring in structure to the engineers, because they had to create a legitimate organization with rules, regulations, strategies, all the stuff that is required for an effective management of an organization that's going to grow and go to the money markets. And there was resistance from the engineers. But how they overcame that resistance is the HR department. They identify several engineers with extremely high quality statistical backgrounds. And the program that they developed, that they sold to the presented to the engineers over a period of time, very much focused on the language of engineering, a lot of statistics, a lot of mathematics, to prove the case of why management structures were necessary for engineers, because they would be more effective, the outputs would be more effective, the return on investments would become more effective, their bonuses would become more effective, so on and so forth. But it was very much the language and the methods address the engineers' needs, concerns, wants, desires, prejudices, and so on, whereas that would not work perhaps with the advertising department or the engineering, or pardon me, or the HR department, whereas in fact it'd be more, here's why we need to bring in these structures, is because we have to treat people more equitably, or whatever. It may be more philosophical types of arguments and reasoning. But the ultimate goal was to prepare Google to go to the money markets. And it's the same for creating an effective diversity and inclusion program. So these links, this is a benchmarking survey you can do on your own, and you can gather up your data and measure your company versus other companies. These slides will be available afterwards, because these aren't working very well with this program, and I don't want to have more headaches. But it's very important to think about this and where you are. And this final slide, Survey Monkey, this helps you develop the necessary questionnaires and metrics, if you're so inclined, to develop measurement methods for your organization, if in fact they don't exist. And then again, I just bring back to this where we started. This is why diversity and inclusion is important, because it affects the bottom line. And that is, And if your company's profitable, everybody benefits from that. It removes the negative threats of layoffs that we've been existing around with COVID. The reasons might be different, but if an organization is having a robust return on their investment, it's better for the employees as well. It's better for the management. It's better for the overall organization. And that contributes to a more thriving, forward-looking, forward-driving economy and culture, such as envisioned by Sheikh Zayed, as stated originally. And as we can see, all three pictures, three different cultures, all engaging in the same practice. And there's a good chance that you may not have been aware that, in fact, this practice is more universal than one may have been aware of. There's the Inuit from Northern Canada, the Eskimos you'd be known them by, two people rubbing their noses together. They're close people. The center you're familiar with, the Emirati, rubbing their noses together. They're close family or friends. And the Maori from New Zealand, close relations. Again, rubbing their noses as a greeting of familiarity. And so we share more in common. We want to always focus on what we share in common than what our differences are. Because to go forward, we have to be able to build the bridges and co-create shared understandings, which leads to trust, which leads to more effective work groups. If you'd like to learn more, there's a few hiccups with the technology, but if you'd like to learn more about programs, the link can take you to their bachelor's degree, master's degree, or potentially a Doctor of Business. So that's the presentation. I want to thank you for your time and effort. And it was 1 hour. Yeah, it's 1 hour that we've been talking. I encourage feedback. If you have any other questions, yes, friendliness and openness are very important as well. But if we get to know each other, that's a very interesting comment. If we get to know each other, the friendliness and openness will come with it. If we're open to talking is the first step. We can look at people, like when I first came here, I would see women in abayas. I was quite uncomfortable because I'm unfamiliar with it. But as you start to talk with people and get to know people, and the stories they share, there's the same stories, just a different part of the journey. There's the same stories that would be shared back home in Canada amongst people. I still remember, it was probably my second weekend here teaching on the master's program. The one woman was talking about how excited she was. This was 5 years ago. Saudi Arabia, women were now allowed to get driver's licenses. Now, coming from Canada, lots of people would laugh at that. Oh, it's so backwards or whatever. But if you put it into a context, women only got the right to vote in Canada at the end of World War I, which is 1919 or 1918, I think it was, which isn't that long. So you're just on different places, but it's through talking that we start to get to know each other and develop shared experiences. And I think that's really, really, really important that we have those, and most people, and it is true, we have biases, but most people also share a desire for goodwill. Most people will reach out a hand in friendship before mistrust. And if we go from that position, inclusion and diversity becomes a lot easier. Do you want Stephen Hawking's working on your Mars mission? Are you one of the greatest minds at the time in cosmology? Or, well, this person, they're an engineer, graduated at the bottom of their class. They took some course in astrophysics in year 2 of their undergrad course. Now, we want to be successful to get to Mars. So as you talk and you get to know people, it's about focusing on the stuff that's important. You know, engineers are engineers, HR people are HR people, you know, and there's always other noise. And that's what a lot of the other stuff is just noise. That I leave with the management, Jamila. That I have no part in. And I do apologize for the, you people are very, very charitable when it comes to the, when it comes to technology. But think about that as you go forward. And those are just some key points to have more effective programs, because there is no one size fits all, and there never will be. And I'm quite sure some of you have been in places where they try and have a one size fits all, and it doesn't work everywhere. It may have worked in the previous organization, but it doesn't work here for a variety of reasons. Maybe it's skepticism of the people, or it could be lack of support from higher ups. Because that's a point that I didn't make, is for any program to be effective, you need support from the upper levels of management in a meaningful way. Not just doing it because they've been mandated by a law of some sort or a proclamation of some sort. But it is 1 + 1 = 3. The amount you learn from other people and you grow and develop yourself. And you become far more viable working in organizations that in fact give you the opportunities. And on that note, we shall stop. And I thank you for your time. And I do apologize for the kerfuffle with the technology. It happens all the time with Zoom, because I never use Zoom. But I encourage you to continue taking on courses and things of that nature. It would be great if they were face-to-face to meet you in person. Is that it? What happened now? Did I get cut off again? No. Oops. Can we leave?